All right, so right now across the United States, we are currently facing a pretty substantial teacher shortage. And so I wanted to get into some of the potential causes for this, what the solutions might be, and also get into some of the history in terms of how we got to this point and how the modern right-wing conservative attacks against public education and teachers very much lines up with their historical attacks that they've waged as well. So here to start us off from Common Dreams, Julia Conley. She says, 5-alarm crisis. U.S. has shortage of 300,000 teachers and school staff. So a little bit of details here. They say the National Education Association president Becky Pringle on Thursday warned that the U.S. teacher shortage has spiraled into a 5-alarm crisis with nearly 300,000 teaching and support positions left unfilled and policymakers taking desperate and in some cases questionable measures to staff classrooms. So they say that Pringle told ABC News that teachers' unions have been warning for years that chronic disinvestment in schools has placed untenable pressure on educators as they face low pay and overcrowded classrooms. So again, a pretty simple solution that you could provide right now to get rid of this teacher shortage would just simply, improve their conditions, hire more people, offer them better pay, offer them better benefits, etc. But somehow that's always out of the question, and you always need to push austerity on public education and austerity for teachers, at least from the conservative perspective. But they say, quote, "We have a crisis in the number of students who are going into the teaching profession and the number of teachers who are leaving it," Pringle told the outlet. But of course, as with everything else, the pandemic just made it worse. And they say, as a survey taken by the NEA earlier this year showed, 91% of educators said pandemic-related stress and burnout is a serious problem in the profession, and 55% reported that they plan to leave their profession earlier than originally planned. So obviously some pretty big shit going on here. 55% saying that they're planning to leave earlier than they otherwise would have. 91% saying that they're facing pandemic-related burnout from this. So again, obviously there's a lot of different multi-factor things that are going into causing this teacher shortage, but they say chronically low pay is a problem in the profession, which was well documented prior to the pandemic, and educators across the country report it as a contributing factor as teachers leave schools. And the national average salary for teachers is about $64,000, but in some states, including Mississippi, South Dakota, and Florida, many educators earn far less. So notice that these are pretty much all conservative-led states. Not really surprising there, but again, you're having disproportionate problems with the amount of teachers that you're hiring in these conservative states disproportionately, while also those states happen to be the same states that are offering them less pay and worse benefits, etc. So, I mean, it's pretty much a one-to-one correlation here in terms of what the actual solutions would be. But they say that while advocates have for years called on state lawmakers to invest heavily in schools in order to recruit and retain highly qualified educators, with Arizona teachers staging a walkout in 2018 after legislators passed corporate tax cuts that would have left the state $100 million short. So, with all this talk coming out from conservatives about how much they care about the debt and deficit, meanwhile, they're just blowing it up in states across the country to give corporate tax cuts to some of the wealthiest billionaires and corporations in the United States, and then using that to justify pushing austerity on public services like education. But they say that Republican leaders this year have turned to other methods of keeping classrooms sufficiently staffed. And of course, on Thursday, the fascist Florida Governor Ron DeSantis unveiled his state's official website recruiting veterans to help fill the gaps in schools. So it's not just veterans, but it's also apparently like cops. He's trying to get veterans and cops to fill the place of teachers and cutting the regulations in terms of what they need to actually be qualified to teach people. So they say that former armed service members do not need a bachelor's degree to teach the state's children. And in keeping with a trend across the country, as at least 12 states have changed or eliminated their licensing requirements for educators in the last year, according to the National Council on Teacher Equality. So instead of just raising their pay, giving them better benefits, stop doing these offensive, ridiculous attacks against teachers in these conservative states, they're instead choosing to try to outsource it to veterans and cops. Okay, so just completely fucking delusional. But they say that Andrew Spar, the union's president, told NBC affiliate WPTV that the shortage is directly linked to other initiatives pushed by DeSantis, including HB 1557, commonly called the Don't Say Gay law, which bars teachers from discussing gender identity and sexual orientation in classrooms up to 3rd grade. And DeSantis' spokesperson said in March that anyone opposed to the bill was probably a groomer or wouldn't denounce the grooming of 4 to 8-year-old children. So, I mean, again, using this type of rhetoric rhetoric portraying teachers as groomers and portraying specifically LGBTQ teachers as groomers and pedophiles. This is obviously going to have some degree of an effect in terms of them wanting to stay at those job positions. But they say that the Republican governor also signed HB 7, which bars teachers from instructing students about racism and white privilege. So again, kind of a link here between wanting to hire veterans and cops to fill these positions, while also trying to heavily ramp up the basically white nationalist propaganda that conservatives across the country are trying to instill in a lot of these public schools. But this is just basically a rundown in terms of why we ended up at this point. Now I want to get to a little bit more of the history of this and how the current Republican attacks, conservative attacks against teachers and public education very much ties into the history of how we got to this point, and also it ties into the current cancellation of $10,000 to $20,000 in student debt that Biden just announced a couple days ago. So here we got a great breakdown from The Intercept's John Swarz, saying that the origin of student debt, Reagan advisor warned that free college would create a dangerous, educated proletariat. Okay, so what are they talking about here? They're saying, in 1970, Ronald Reagan was running for re-election as the governor of California. He had first won in 1966 with confrontational rhetoric towards the University of California public college system and executed confrontational policies when in office. And in May of 1970, Reagan had shut down all 28 UC and Cal State campuses in the midst of student protests against the Vietnam War and the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. And on October 29th, less than a week before the election, his education advisor, Roger A. Freeman, spoke at a press conference to defend him. So we're going to get to his quote here in a second, but already, I mean, they're targeting public schools, right? They're targeting the university system within California. Why? Because they were protesting the Vietnam War and the bombing of Cambodia. So what I'm trying to get you guys to understand is how these attacks against LGBTQ teachers, these attacks and, portraying public education as though it's filled with like woke, radical Marxist propagandists or something like that, is very much tied to the same exact Cold War propaganda and rhetoric that we were seeing from motherfuckers like Ronald Reagan all the way back in the 60s and 70s. But they say that Freeman's remarks were reported the next day in the San Francisco Chronicle under the headline, "Professor Sees Peril in Education." And according to the Chronicle article, Freeman said, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat that's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go to college." Okay, so again, it's pretty transparent. It's a lot easier when you're going back and looking at what they historically used to say, especially during the Cold War, because they were a lot more loose with their anti-communist, anti-socialist rhetoric that they were using here. But I mean, he's just explicitly saying the quiet part out loud here, right? He's saying if we have a more educated proletariat, especially at a lot of these more left-wing schools, or at least where there are a lot of young people who are starting to, join in with a socialist movement, a communist movement, an anarchist movement, whatever you want to say, that as these people are being educated and they are starting to move to the left with their political ideological framework, they're saying we can't allow for that. Why? Because again, it ties back to the same underlying class principles here. They want an uneducated and exploitable proletariat or workforce that they can use to dominate for profit. I mean, that's what this comes down to at the end of the day, right? This connects very much into the attacks against teachers right now as being like woke radical Marxists or as being pedophiles or groomers. It's not even necessarily about them being groomers, right? I don't even believe that a lot of conservatives genuinely believe it when they're launching those attacks, but it's more so about this control aspect. It's more so about, beating back any aspect of public investment in institutions, things that could materially improve people's lives, pushing back against the ability for working class people to be educated, to organize, to engage in protests against the imperial actions of the government. All of these different things tie back to the same exact class dynamics, but they continue here pretty much laying it out even more explicitly and even getting some institutional backing here from the FBI and the CIA. So they say that a core theme of Reagan's first gubernatorial campaign in 1966 was resentment towards California's public colleges, and in particular UC Berkeley, with Reagan repeatedly vowing to clean up the mess there. And Berkeley, then nearly free to attend for California residents, had become a national center for organizing against the Vietnam War. A deep anxiety about this reached the highest levels of the U.S. government, with John McCone, the head of the CIA, requesting a meeting with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, to discuss communist influence at Berkeley, a situation that definitely required some coercive action. Okay, so again, you have the FBI and the CIA who are getting in with the government and conservatives and the McCarthyites within the government at the time to push back against these college campuses, where you just had people who were trying to stand up against the completely unjustifiable war in Vietnam and the bombing of Cambodia. So all of this, again, ties back together with the imperialist foreign policy of the United States, how that ties back domestically with the police state, with the institutions like the FBI and the CIA. Again, all of these are right-wing institutions. They are defending the status quo that allows capitalists both around the world in the imperialist sense and also domestically here with, pushing out this communist or socialist influence at these universities, just trying to control the working class as much as possible and to make sure that people are not educated so that they are not organized and don't have the ability to push back against the authoritarian structure of the capitalist system. But they continue here saying that Reagan pushed to cut state funding for California's public colleges, but did not reveal his ideological motivation. Rather, he said the state simply needed to save money. So again, ties back to what we just saw with, a lot of these conservative states coming out here giving $100 million tax cuts to the wealthiest billionaires and corporations in their states, while then using that budget deficit there of $100 million to then justify pushing austerity on public institutions that actually fucking matter, like public education. But they say to cover the funding shortfall, Reagan suggested that California public colleges could charge residents tuition for the first time, and this, he complained, resulted in the almost hysterical charge that this would deny educational opportunities to those of the most moderate means. This is obviously untrue. We made it plain that tuition must be accompanied by adequate loans to be paid back after graduation. So if you're wondering who sort of kicked off this massive explosion in tuition costs and how much it costs to get a higher education and why 44 million Americans are currently saddled with absurd amounts of student debt, you can thank this motherfucker Ronald Reagan. But they continue saying that the success of Reagan's attacks on California public colleges inspired conservative politicians across the U.S., and Nixon decried campus revolt. And Spiro Agnew, his vice president, proclaimed that thanks to the open admissions policies, unqualified students are being swept into college on the wave of new socialism. Okay, so again, went from Ronald Reagan, transitioned the same exact rhetoric and policy framework to Richard Nixon, and has successfully continued since then. But they finish off here saying that prominent conservative intellectuals also took up the charge. Privately, one worried that free education may be producing a positively dangerous class situation by raising the expectations of working class students. And another referred to college students as a parasite feeding on the rest of society who exhibited a failure to understand and to appreciate the crucial role played by the reward-punishment structure of the market. And the answer was to close off the parasitic option. Okay, he's saying by the reward punishment structure of the market, okay, and he's saying we should not invest in accessible public education, especially not in college, because that is going to lead to a diminishing impact of the reward punishment structure of the market. So in other words, they use public education, they use the fact that tuition costs are what they are right now in order to try to crush working class people. That is all that this is about. When conservatives are coming out right now exploding and losing their goddamn minds over this mild student debt forgiveness that Biden is coming out with, this is partially why, because they don't want an educated workforce. They don't want a workforce that is aware of organizing principles and how they can actually collectively act to their own benefit to make demands from the capitalist class. They don't want any of that. And so instead, they are choosing to focus on attacks on these institutions, on underfunding these institutions, on calling them radical woke Marxist centers for communist influence within the United States. And now, in a more modern sense, using some of the attacks that we've seen from conservatives in the wake of Biden forgiving this student debt. So just as one example here and how this again ties into the imperialism of the United States, here from Jim Banks, just absolutely screaming the quiet part out loud. He says student loan forgiveness undermines one of our military's greatest recruitment tools at a time of dangerously low enlists. Okay, so again, he's coming and saying the quiet part out loud here. What is he saying? He's saying that we, the military, the U.S. empire, uses the fact that people cannot afford higher education to try to get better opportunities in life, and we are using that fact and weaponizing it against poor Americans to basically just do a poverty draft into the military and say that, oh, you want to go and improve your standing in life, you want to get a higher education, you want to go find a job that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do without that education, well, fuck you, first you have to go serve the imperialist war machine. So I guess thank you for saying the quiet part out loud and just making it explicitly clear for everybody. But now I want to finish off here with, tying this historical analysis and tying this historical context into the modern context of this current right-wing reactionary attack against public education and teachers in this country. So let's go ahead and see the crossover comparisons here between, under the Ronald Reagan and the Richard Nixon administrations versus where we're at right now.
We're overplaying the importance of education.
So, Doctor, this is grooming, right?
Brainwashing toddlers with racist drivel.
Cameras in the classroom as we put them on the chests of police officers.
But I don't think these teachers are even smart enough to be in the classroom.
Teachers hate teaching, and they hate their students.
They legit hate your kids.
They're lazy, they're incompetent.
Sluggish cat ladies in sweats stained with chocolate eclairs.
The KKK with summers off.
Teachers make 20% less than people with similar degrees, but they also work 20% less. They have school, they have the summers off.
They would like less work, no accountability, and much more pay.
They're teaching our children to sext.
They took God out of our schools, Sandra.
To view pornography.
And then the left replaced it with CRT, which is this neo-Marxist religion.
What they are doing is grooming our children for sexual predators.
This is a new world order. Everything they do is anti-kid, anti-parent.
Why don't you go in there, thrash the teacher, and you're going to get hurt. And I think that should be the rule still. You get beaten up, you should be beaten up.
Okay, so, yeah, in some cases, especially from Tucker Carlson there, the most successful white nationalist propagandist in the country, in some cases just straight up encouraging violence, outright violence against teachers, but also you see the underlying narratives that they were pushing there, right? Teachers are groomers, especially gay and trans teachers. They're groomers, they're pedophiles, they're trying to go after your children, talking about CRT, critical race theory, which is just a lens of analysis to try to analyze how the history of racism in this country ties into legal frameworks and our institutions, etc., and framing that as though it is this neo-Marxist takeover of the country or something like that. Again, all of this, it might seem somewhat scattershot and they're just pulling shit out of their ass, which they 100% are. But again, the underlying motivation for this, the underlying reason why they are doing this is the same exact goddamn reasons that Ronald Reagan was trying to undercut and defund the education system in California back in the 1960s and 70s. It is all a pushback against any supposed left-wing introduction for young people in this country. It is trying to push a more nationalist and pro-capitalist education system. It is trying to prevent people from engaging in anti-war protests, anti-imperialist protests, exploitation protests, okay? Trying to prevent people from being able to organize along class lines or even be educated along class lines and engage in some of that solidarity to push back against the authoritarian power of the capitalist system. So, this is all connected, right? It's not a conspiracy to suggest that there's a direct through line between what we saw under previous Republican administrations throughout history and what we're seeing right now. This is them trying to completely undercut public education, trying to push forward with charter schools and private schools as Betsy DeVos was doing under the Trump administration, trying to undercut these public institutions, trying to further undercut public faith and trust in the government in general. And all of this is in service of the capitalist class. All of this is in service of trying to push people to believe that, you can't trust these universities, you can't trust public school teachers because they're trying to indoctrinate your kids into some woke gender ideology or into Marxist ideology or something like that. All of this, again, is just to say the same thing. This all comes down to class dynamics. All of this comes down to the same underlying reason why they were doing these attacks under the Ronald Reagan and the Nixon administrations and are now continuing to do it to this day. And we see the consequences now. We have a massive nationwide teacher shortage, but beyond that, they are going to continue these attacks and continue to try to gut one of the most fundamental and important institutions that we have in this country with education. So we have to be aware of not only what they're trying to do right now, but also how this ties into the broader narrative that has been constructed for decades in this country.